Ever wondered what would happen if you had a leak behind the transmission? Well, this is the case for my car. I found that there was an oil leak. There was oil dripping down here at this bolt here that mounts from the transmission. This is the transmission bell housing to the back of the engine here. So you don't see it, but if you were to inspect, put your finger inside this inspection hole here and look at that. That is evidence of an oil leak leaking behind the engine, the rear engine. Fun times. This is one of the oil leaks that you do not want to have, because guess what? You have to get the transmission out, and there's just, look at that. Just tons of evidence of an oil leak behind the transmission bell housing. Now, you could say, well, there probably is a rear main seal leak. I need to drop this transmission. Hooray. Hooray for me, and inspect it. Since I'm basically doing a clutch job anyway, I need to take out the clutch and the flywheel to access the rear main seal. Might as well do that, and also as well replace the pilot bearing. Now, that's the best case scenario. Upon further inspection, I need to see if there is any oil leaking behind or near the timing chain cover, because the timing chain cover is located on the back side of this car for this engine. If that's the case, that sucks, because now I would need to take out the rear timing chain covers and reseal it with gasket. That takes a lot more time and a lot more precision, because, well, you have to clean everything up and then reseal everything with silicone. So let's get started and take off this transmission to find out what is the cause of this oil leak I have here. Okay, first step is to take the rear off. I won't bore you with the details here, but the rear has been taken off. The bumper cover, the exhaust, the crash bar is off. The next step is to take off this rear cross member here, as well as I'm gonna go and take off this cross member here as well. It's gonna give me a little bit more access to hook where is my hoist? My engine hoist right here. Thank you, Harbor Freight. And I'll be able to go and take off this transmission here. Now, once I have all this top stuff out, I also need to take off the trim here, left and right trims. And the most important thing, I need to take off this oil tank here. This is the oil tank that holds the majority of the oil for the Audi R8. Furthermore, what else do I need to take off? Oh, by the way, yes, I do need to take off the starter. And I also need to take off, let's zoom in here. Right here, I need to take off the drive shafts, because it hooks to a flange here, and I need to take off both drive shafts that's connecting to the transmission here. So once all this top stuff here, this two cross members here are taken off, I also need to take out the rear sway bar. This is the rear sway bar here. It is being held on by a couple of bolts here against this bushing here, as well as, let's see here, two nuts here, one on each side. Where is the nut? The nut is right here. So it's a simple job, and this will also be good time for me to take this off and lube the bushing with some white lithium grease to make sure that it does not squeak when I reinstall the rear sway bar bushing. Once this bushing is out, I can then drain the oil in this oil tank and then take this off. Once I have this off, I'll be able to then move ahead and take off the starter. And certainly before you even start touching that starter, you have to disconnect the battery. So once I've disconnected the battery, I'll then be able to go ahead and start working and take off that starter, which is around here. And I'll show you more in details soon enough. And that rear cross member has been removed. So let's go and take a look of what we see here. Here are the three main rivets that on each side that hold this cross member together. However, I want to highlight something here that you should all be aware of right here. This is, yeah, there you go. Right there, you see that brown color? That is rust. These are 14-year-old rivets, ladies and gentlemen. These rivets look, the inner rivets look good, but these outer rivets, yeah, there is some rust and corrosion here. So that is one thing that I've always am going to do now, working on this older Gen 1 R8, is to lubricate these old rivets. They're here, right here. So you see that there is some red rust and corrosion here. And I've mentioned this in my previous video that you can check out in the link above. I will always use some sort of lubricant. In this case, I'll use a WD-40 dry lube with PTFE. This will help protect and lubricate these threads here, because whenever I'm wrenching on a rivet nut now these days with this old car, I pray that these rivet nuts are still holding so I could break the nut and loosen the nut off the thread. So pro tip, again, I cannot emphasize this enough, everyone. Check the status of your rivets, especially your rivet nuts on this frame, and make sure to clean them and then just lubricate them. So here we are draining this oil, getting ready to remove the oil tank. And while it's drained the oil, let me explain how you remove the oil tank. There are a couple connectors and bolts. First thing is, let's go over here, bolt number 1 here, remove that bolt. There are 2 bolts behind this hose right here. You remove those. And let's see here, what else? There, I believe there is another bolt right here, right around here that you need to remove. Those are the mounting bolts for the oil tank. Furthermore, you need to remove these 2 hoses here, as well as this oil return line. There are 2 screws in the back, and the oil supply line, which is down here. Let's see here if I can go in here. Right there is the oil supply line. You remove those 2 bolts right there, as you can see. And finally, you also need to remove the connector for the oil sensor in the back of the tank over here. So the oil tank is officially out. Let's go and see what the car looks like now with that oil tank off. Here we go. Here is what the car looks like now. There is a lot more room here, as you can see here. This clears up a lot of space. And once we get the oil tank off, we have a clear view of the starter here. Next step is to remove the starter. Need to unplug this electrical connection, and there are a couple mounting points on this starter. And let's see here, this is the positive line, I believe. And once we have that, then we'll be able to unmount the starter. There should be 2 bolts right here, like one around here and one below here. So some of you may have noticed how dirty this side of the transmission is, and this is leftover carbon from the exhaust, because when I got this car and I was in the process of changing out the exhaust, I noticed that right here, the V-clamp was not entirely clamped to this side of the exhaust. So as the car was running, it was spewing out a bunch of exhaust particles onto this entire side of the transmission. So there we go. Here's a pro tip for you. If you find that there is a lot of carbon stuff right here, chances are the V-clamp did not clamp onto this flex pipe to the exhaust entirely. We need to go and take off this heat shield on both sides of the transmission so we can access the bolts that hold the axle against this flange here. So that will allow us to be able to start taking out this transmission. It looks like I think I could actually just take off this transmission without having to remove this crossbeam right here that I originally intended to do, because I think, yeah, if I put the hoist over here, it could hook around this middle part, add another rope or harness around here, and then I'll be able to just simply guide this out. I forgot to mention that we also need to route a couple of the lines for the power steering hose out of the way, especially this bolt here. The factory service manual says to remove this high pressure line off this power steering pump. Now, I've seen some people actually take off this entire power steering unit off the engine to make it easier, because things are still pretty tight here when you're maneuvering and taking out the transmission here, because there may not be enough room if you simply remove this. I'm gonna try to figure out and see if I can take off this and maneuver the transmission out. If not, if it's too difficult, then yeah, I have to remove the power steering pump out of the way. So it's the next day. I have way more light now. I've opened up the garage. Let's see here. Starter has been taken off. Next step is to take off these heat shields for the drive shafts. Over here, these are triple splines. And then, yeah, I think there are 3 bolts here for this year of this car. And then I need to take out this bolt right here so I could take off both sides of the heat shield. Once both heat shields are off, I could then start and take off these triple spline bolts here that attach the drive shaft to the transmission. And then after that, unattach these shifter cables, take off this whole piece over here, and then everything should be clear and ready to go for me to unmount the mount points over here on these transmission mounts, as well as the bell housing mounts that are way in the back over here. There you go, there's 1 bolt over there. Well, yeah, it's better. It's just easier to take off the power steering pump over here. What I did was I removed the supply line, and then I kept the high pressure hose on the power steering pump because it's really torqued in and it's really hard to actually, with the wrench it off. So I've been able to take this off. Right here, there are 3 bolts that need to get taken off. What else you need to know? Be careful, because now you need to get new seals. I believe there's 1 seal in here and then there's 1 seal outside. So be sure to replace those seals before you reinstall the power steering pump. Now I've been able to easily just snake this in. I think it's an M10 triple spline bolts, and then I'll be able to get this off and then move ahead and take this heat shield off so I can easily take off these other triple spline bolts for both sides of the axle shafts. One of the drive shafts is out. It was an M12 triple spline that I used. It was this one. I went in and I actually used the e-brake to add a counterforce. Once I had the e-brake on, I was able to then break loose all these bolts. And I just rotated the drive shaft. Took the e-brake off, rotated the drive shaft, put the e-brake back on, and then proceeded to break loose all these bolts and then just easily take them off. We're almost done prepping here. We need to take off these oil cooler lines here. And there's 1 more right here. There is an oil cooler line here. We need to take those off. And you need to take off the clutch line down below here. Now, that's for the manual transmission. Now, if you have an R8 transmission, you would need to go through the motion of taking off the hydraulic pump and reservoir that will sit here, as well as all the connectors that connect to the R8, and these are the old R8 connectors that I had. Okay, good pro tip I learned from my research is before you even start taking out all the bolts here for the bell housing, make sure to remove the speed sensor here, because during this plastic can break and then this speed sensor here will cost a lot of money. So next step is to take off the shifter cables from the shifter itself right here. There's the factory service manual says that you can get a pry bar and pry it off the ball joints here, but that's just more work than needed. I just simply took off the shifter cables on this end and then just simply take off this mount point here for the shifter cables. We are ready, set to go to start to break the bolts off the studs around the bell housing. Then after that, we're ready to hook this transmission up to the engine hoist and take this transmission out. start unbolting all of the bolts that are attached to the bell housing here. And I'll show you there are 8 bolts that we need to detach. The first step is to take out this bolt and then take out the lower 4 nuts here that are on these studs here. Once we have that, we need to go and take off the 2 mounts here for the transmission mount right here. And once those are off, we could then start taking off the nuts up top of the bell housing. And once everything's there, you could then hook the engine hoist onto this transmission, and then you start pulling it out. So this part I wanted to narrate, but my neighbors were a little noisy, so I had to go ahead and record this in my room right now. When you're taking off the nuts off the studs of the bell housing, there's this one nut here that you see that is tucked in and it's hard to take out. You have to use a crowfoot wrench along with an extension and connect that with a ratchet towards the back of the bell housing. Once you've taken the side nut off, every other nut on these studs are pretty straightforward. So let's take a look at the bell housing here. You can obviously see there was oil leak right here. Right here, all this sludge gathered on the bottom of the bell housing here. So it's definitely confirmed that the leak is coming from within the rear of the engine. So let's take a look at the rear of the engine right now. So you see here's the clutch and the pressure plate. If this leak is also a result of a leaking rear main seal, which I need to take off the pressure plate and clutch pack. After that, I need to take off the flywheel. From here, everything is pretty straightforward. There's 9 bolts here that you need to take off on the pressure plate. Then after that, we will go and see and look at the flywheel. The clutch is out. Next step is to take these flywheel bolts out. There are 10 flywheel bolts. Now, in order to do this, you're gonna need some leverage. And so Audi has a special tool to lock the crankshaft in order to be able to give you leverage so you can unbolt these flywheel bolts. Now, this tool goes in underneath here. Now, there is a bolt under here that I need to take out and insert this crankshaft locking tool in order to be able to lock the crankshaft. Now, in order to do that, I need to rotate the engine to top dead center TDC. And how you do that, there are 3 notches that need to line up on the harmonic balancer, as well as 2 other pulleys that are in the front of the engine. And you can see here, there's a thin layer of oil around the center here. And that looks like a leaking rear main seal. So yeah, it is confirmed. I do have a leaking rear main seal here. So you see there's like oil everywhere. There is oil that is going through here, that is dripping. I think it's dripping from here. One thing to note here, you can see all of this grease here. I thought that this bearing was actually shot. I talked with an expert in my network and he told me that this is actually grease that was packed from the factory. They actually packed this bearing and this whole entire area with grease as well. So this came from the factory. I only need to replace the rear main seal and this pilot bearing because yeah, might as well. All right, that seal is off along with the pilot bearing. I just used a seal tool to go in and pry it out. It was pretty easy. It took me about 5 seconds to get this out. And as for the pilot bearing, what I used was a slide hammer with a little hook here. So let's go over there and take a look at the slide hammer. This is the slide hammer that I use, along with these little hooks that went in. And here is the pilot bearing. It went in here, and then I was able to go and yank this out within like 2 pulls of this slide hammer. So this is the R8 clutch here, and I inspected it, and the thing that I found out is that this is a dual plated clutch, meaning that it has 2 friction discs here. So there's the one that faces the flywheel, and this is the other one that lies here. And they designed this way to increase the holding power end of the clutch for high torque applications. So that is the design of this clutch. And I found that you can't really look at the face of this clutch and see if this clutch is worn down all the way down to the rivet here. Usually that makes sense for, I believe, for a single plated clutch. This clutch disc has 2 friction surfaces, and you need to look at both sides of the clutch and measure them all the way around. And I've measured it. The top part here, all around, I've measured it. It's around 6.4 millimeters. That's how thick it is. And I measured the inside disc to be around 6 millimeters. Johnny Bros, one of the R8 experts, thank you, shout out to Johnny. He told me that based on seeing this, it's about 40 to 50% worn. I have an option. Do I put this back in, or do I go all in and get a new clutch disc, new flywheel? Anyway, so that is how I inspected this clutch disc here. There you have it. I've done as much as I can on this car. I'm waiting on a few parts like the rear main seal, the pilot bearing, plus my new flywheel bolts, as well as a couple of other O-rings and things that I would need to replace after tearing half of this car apart. So there we have it. I'll see you in the next video. Hopefully you like this content. If you do, please support this channel by liking and subscribing. Thanks.